Hello, I'm Calvin Andrassi, and we're asking the question, what is economics? So let's sit back and talk a little bit about what makes this discipline what it is. All right? So economics is the study of how society ultimately allocates its scarce resources. Of course, scarcity is the notion that not everything is in an unlimited supply, that there is only a certain amount of any good and service and resources in general to go around. They are in short supply, they are finite, and we have to figure out how best to allocate those resources to achieve whatever goals we're trying to achieve in our society. Okay? So the word economics itself is derived from the Greek oikonomia, oikos being the root word meaning the home or the household, and nomia essentially is the systematic study of. So in many respects it is the study of things that go on in the home, or more accurately perhaps household management. And this goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks. You have Aristotle talking about economics many thousands of years ago. Okay? In a similar vein, you have Alfred Marshall discuss economics as the study of people, their income, and how they use it, right? So it is all about the wealth and the resources that are available to people, and the way in which that is all being utilized. Okay? And then we usually divide up economics into two general schools of thought, if you will. There are microeconomics, which are the study of individual economic decisions and those kinds of realities. Micro, of course, meaning small, like a microscope lets you look at small things. And, multiple disciplines have both micro and, of course, macro approaches to them. There's macrobiology, microbiology. You can study all sorts of different types of decision-making processes, either at the small level or the grand level. So that being said, macroeconomics is the study of the broader, more system-wide economic realities. So instead of looking at the individual, looking at a region, looking at a country, looking at the aggregated or collective decisions in the economy at a larger scale. Okay? Another important element of economics is to examine the actors that are involved in economic decision making. Okay? So first and foremost, perhaps truest to the classical Greek definition of the word, we have the consumers, right? So consumers are those individuals who are actually utilizing and consuming the goods that are made of the scarce resources and services that similarly use those resources. And consumers, their ultimate goal is to try to maximize what we call utility derived from the goods and services. So utility refers to the ultimate satisfaction and usefulness of those goods and services. They're trying to get the most out of the things that they are purchasing at a market. Okay? On kind of the flip side of that, we have business firms. Okay? So producers. And they are the individuals that, are making the goods and services that are being consumed by the consumers. They're the ones that are utilizing the resources in order to put together the goods and resources, goods and services that are going to be consumed. Okay, and their goal isn't necessarily to maximize utility, because in this capacity they're not trying to get and use those goods themselves, but rather they are trying to maximize the financial gain they get from the goods and services that they produce, and that financial gain is known as profit. Okay? Meanwhile, the third set of actors here is the government and the various governments that are out there. And it's essentially the legal and the social framework that is in place to ensure that the economy is operating as it should and that society is operating as it should. And as such, governments are trying to maximize the welfare of the public. Okay? And then another set of things that you need to know in order to really understand economics are the types of issues and the types of topics of concern that make themselves apparent in the discipline. So first and foremost, we have the production function, okay? And that's all about creating and maintaining the supply of the goods and services that are available. That includes land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, which are the factors of production. So land is anything that is a place in which the goods are produced and created. Labor is the work and energy that goes into the production. Capital are the resources that essentially are going into the production. And entrepreneurship refers to the skills and the drive and the risk that is willing to be taken in the production function. Okay? The consumption function, meanwhile, is all about demand. It is about looking at the various types of alternatives that exist for an individual to consume and the opportunity costs associated with choosing one alternative over another. Okay? So in the process of consuming your goods and services, every time you are choosing one of the alternatives over another, it means that you are foregoing the other opportunity, the other product, so that you're not able to do everything that you want and need to do at the same time, right? In order to go to school, for example, you have to forego hanging out with friends or going down to the beach or going to a party or even working and making money, right? In order to be able to buy an iPad or an iPhone, you have to forego other tablets or other alternative means of getting the same basic utility out of various types of goods and services. Okay? Resources. So again, resources are scarce, and the big problem in resources is that lack of infinite availability for those goods and services. Resources are what you're using to make those final goods and services, right? They are the inputs in the factors of production. Okay? And then the last main economic issue that we are concerned with is what the general health of the economy is like. So when we talk about macroeconomics, that's a lot of the topics of discussion that we're going to be getting into. So things like growth and the contraction of the economy, as the economy gets stronger, what happens as it enters into recessionary phases, what happens, the business cycle is something that we're going to be talking about in that sense, which is an ongoing cycle of growth and contraction in the economy. And other things that kind of indicate how strong and how healthy the economy are is the gross domestic product, which we're going to talk about in significant detail. That's the sum total of all the production in a country in a given period of time. And in addition to that, we look at numbers like unemployment and inflation and various types of confidence, including consumer confidence, business confidence, confidence in the stock market and real estate markets. All those sorts of things kind of go into understanding what it means to have a degree of economic health. Okay? So specifically on the topic of governments, right? So I think consumers and firms are pretty easy to understand. one makes the goods, one buys the goods. Governments have their own special place, especially in the macroeconomic school of thought. Economics try to incorporate many different types of social sciences, including political science, and to some extent sociology is involved, probably psychology to a significant extent. But as far as governments themselves, again in that vein of political science, there are lots of different systems that exist out there, and those different types of systems may be conducive to certain types of economic systems. So governments can be democratic. Here in the United States, we have a democratic republic. Technically, they can be direct democracies where the citizens make all decisions by vote or direct participation. You can have authoritarian types of governments like dictatorships, totalitarian systems, fascist systems, theocratic systems where religious authorities are in control. Oligarchies, where essentially there's a small group of the quote-unquote elite that are in charge. You can have military juntas. A classic example of that would be if you look at the country of Myanmar, formerly known as Burma. Military dictatorship there for a pretty significant amount of time in recent history. Of course, you have communist systems, which communism is an economic system, but it is somewhat of a total social system as well, which does include totalitarian elements in the case of the USSR. And then plutocratic systems, where the wealthy are ultimately in charge. If you don't have a system of government in place, that's what's known as anarchy, right? So ultimately, governments are responsible for making the rules and the regulations, and those regulations, from an economic perspective, are there to prevent failures in the market. They are there to make sure that the market continues to operate. Now, that being said, in something like a communist system, the government is also responsible for making essentially all of the production and consumption decisions in the society, determining who gets what, rather than allowing the market to decide. But nevertheless, in most countries in the world, with an exception of maybe, arguably there are 16 socialist and Marxist-Leninist communist countries in the world. Aside from those, the 180 some odd, depending on how you're counting how many countries there are, do not have a command economy, which allows the government to make those kinds of economic decisions, but rather utilize a market. So, when we're talking about government, generally we're going to be talking about it as what's most popular in the world, and that is for government to support a market system. Okay? So let's talk about, on the flip side, or I guess the same, the other face of the same coin, the different types of economies that are present in the world. Okay? So first and foremost, the most common, again, 180 or so different countries have free market or capitalist style economies. Okay? And that is where there is private ownership of the means of production, which means that firms can exist that are there to generate and maximize profit. Okay? In a free market system, there is oftentimes competition between various firms, and that is what results in the establishment of prices. It's a big interplay of supply and demand in the market, and which types of entities have the advantage in the production of certain goods and services. Okay? So what a market system allows for is an efficient allocation of the goods and services. That comes from David Ricardo, who talks about efficiency in the system that we're going to talk about later on. But the unfortunate reality is that because a market is in place, which requires individuals to have the means to acquire goods and services on the market, that system often can lead to various degrees of inequity, which means that there will be individuals that have more wealth and individuals who have less wealth that will be better and worse able to acquire the goods and services that they're trying to get on the market. Okay? And then some special types of free market systems. You have a laissez-faire capitalist system where the general belief is that the market is self-regulating and it tries to avoid having too many government regulations. In the world, a country like Singapore would be a good example of a country that's striving to achieve a very laissez-faire system, kind of a hands-off approach to achieving ideal market conditions. Then there are also welfare capitalist systems that really emphasize wealth redistribution, and very famously, some of the Nordic European countries tend to have these welfare capitalist systems where there is an extensive amount of redistribution of wealth from the wealthier individuals and placed into the hands of individuals with less wealth. Okay? So the second type of economy is a socialist economy, and as I mentioned, there are 16 communist and socialist systems out there. 12 of those are considered socialist systems, either by their own admission, not necessarily by practice, but at least they're striving to be socialist systems. And those are systems in which the government owns a majority share in businesses, or indeed there is no private ownership whatsoever. Okay, so as far as the Nordic countries that we mentioned, oftentimes it's discussed that they are socialist systems. I would strongly argue against that. For the most part, they have very strong property ownership rights in those countries, so they are welfare capitalist systems rather than socialist systems. But when we talk about socialism, ultimately what we're talking about is the government having control over the means of production. It's according to Karl Marx, who essentially is one of the major sociologists that discuss the notions of socialism and communism. It's supposed to be the workers that are in control, but what does that really mean? You need some sort of an entity in place that represents the workers, most likely, unless you have a direct system of ownership by the workers. So if you don't, if you have a very large country, for example, that might not necessarily be possible. So the idea there is that government is going to fulfill that role of being in charge of the means of production for the workers, essentially, right? So as far as the sales of goods, anytime a good is sold, it produces what's called a social dividend, which goes back into either funding the government to be able to provide goods and services for the populace, or it gets translated into a universal basic income where everybody essentially gets the same amount of money or varying degrees of income, perhaps based on their profession and things like that. But that comes from the government sale of goods and services. Okay? So in a socialist system, it is inefficient, right? But it does seek equity, right? So individuals without wealth tend to be better off, arguably, in a socialist system. I mean, definitely arguably. But the fact is that the allocation of resources is not as efficient as it would be in a market system, and socialist systems do tend to run into problems with essentially there being an excessive scarcity of goods and services because they aren't being maximally allocated in the most efficient way possible. So there are oftentimes shortages that often tend to arise in socialist systems. So, perhaps while on paper there is equity, it's not necessarily always the case because there are shortages that lead to oftentimes perhaps a worse off quality of life in many of the systems. That's not to say that there aren't powerful socialist systems that are capable of being slightly more efficient than other systems. Okay, and then we have command and planned economies, right, where that kind of goes hand in hand with socialism. Socialist systems usually do have some degree of planning by the government and a command system, but as far as taking that to a high degree, there are 4 countries in the world that consider themselves Marxist-Leninist, that do have a significant degree of government control over the means of production. And of course the USSR, way back following World War I, would be considered kind of the pinnacle or most powerful of those planned economies up until the late 1980s, early 1990s, where the Soviet system collapsed and it switched over to more of a arguably socialist but also free market capitalist sort of a system. Now, in a command economy or a planned economy, all of the economic activity is controlled by the government, and there is what we call central economic planning. It comes from a relatively small number of individuals, usually in this case the Communist Party. Central authority determines what is produced, and again, it's inefficient, but it does try to seek some degree of equity, right? It tries to lessen the gap between the rich and the poor, but again, the problem is that oftentimes there are problems related to shortages in that system that are prolonged and continue to be problematic. Okay, so those are some of the core elements of economics that are somewhat universal. They are relevant both in micro and macroeconomics, so it's good to kind of have a good grasp of those concepts. Make sure that in approaching economics you thoroughly understand these concepts, because they are going to pop up in economic theory. They're going to pop up when you talk about monetary and fiscal policies in macroeconomics. They're going to be central to understanding the decision-making process in microeconomics. So these are the core elements. These are the foundational blocks that build into both micro and macroeconomics. And from here, we're going to get into some of the more nuanced and detailed elements of the economic systems that are available to us. And we're going to come to understand the way that the economy will ultimately play out, and what allows for an economy to be both stable and healthy, despite the fact that, again, there are scarce resources and there are potentials for economic growth and contraction and recession based on the way in which the system kind of plays out.